I'm doing my movement project over the brain. The brain is an organ of the central nervous system. It receives sensory input and integrates information to form perception and thought. The brain also controls activities such as speech and movement. It also helps maintain homeostasis. It is located within the cranium and covered by the meninges. Major regions of the brain include the cerebrum, cerebellum, the thalamus and hypothalamus, and the brainstem, which includes the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebrum is responsible for higher intellectual functions and conscious thought. It also processes sensory and motor information, and the basal ganglia coordinate movement together. The cerebellum is the part of the brain that fine-tunes body movement and manages balance along with posture. Its location is posterior to the brainstem and inferior to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. The cerebellum subconsciously evaluates body movement and sends signals to the cerebral cortex of the cerebrum to adjust skeletal muscles as needed. The thalamus plays a role in learning and memory. It consists of several nuclei that pass sensory information to different regions of the cerebral cortex. It also determines what sensory information is important enough to be consciously aware of the sensory input. The hypothalamus regulates automatic nervous functions, emotions and behavior, food consumption, circadian rhythms, and the body temperature. It also produces hormones that influence the pituitary gland and regulate endocrine function. The brainstem is part of the brain that is connected to the spinal cord. It consists of the medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. Motor and sensory neurons that connect the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system pass through the brainstem. The brainstem controls involuntary functions of the respiratory, digestive, and circulatory systems. It also contributes to hearing, balance, and gustation. The midbrain contains nuclei which are called that control visual and auditory reflexes. It also contains nuclei for cranial nerves 3 and 4. The medulla oblongata contains nuclei that regulate automatic functions such as respiration and heartbeat. The pons contains tracts and nuclei that link parts of the brain together. Both contain nuclei for several cranial nerves. The cerebral cortex processes sensory information and motor information, while the basal ganglia coordinate learned movement. It also has folds called gyri, which are then separated by grooves called sulci. The cerebral cortex, which is the outermost part of the cerebrum, has a left and right hemisphere. Different parts of the cerebral cortex process different information. Motor signals are transmitted mainly from the anterior cortex, while sensory signals are received and processed in the posterior regions of the cortex. Each hemisphere consists of a frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe. The left and right hemispheres are responsible for different functions. The left hemisphere is responsible for language and calculations, while the right is responsible for visual, emotional, and artistic awareness. Each hemisphere controls opposite sides of the brain. The limbic system includes several structures located above the thalamus and hypothalamus that create a functional classification of the brain. Limbic structures are associated with emotions, smell, and memory. Ventricles, which are cavities inside the brain, are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid supports the central nervous system by absorbing impacts and exchanging nutrients and waste with the blood system. It is produced in the carotid plexus on the ventricle walls and circulates to the ventricles in the meninges and spinal cord. The blood is supplied to the brain through the internal carotid and vertebral arteries and drained through the dural venous sinuses and internal jugular vein. Capillary walls in the brain and the astrocytes that surround these capillaries form a blood-brain barrier that prevents harmful substances from entering the brain. Here is my brain model. It has the frontal lobe in yellow, the parietal lobe in blue, occipital lobe in red, the cerebellum in orange, temporal lobe in green, and the spinal cord is the gray.